But the wicked are like the tossing sea that cannot keep still. Its waters toss up mire and mud. There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked. That verse is one that comes to my mind as I think about current times. And when I wonder what to do with my anger and frustration at injustice, at the life-denying systems and forces that are so evident on display, not just in our country, but across the world. And I think that there is finally no peace for the wicked. Interestingly, if you were to stand alongside Frederick Douglass in 1853, 1854, just after he gave his famous speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," you would have heard that verse many times. It was one of Douglass's favorite verses in the 1850s, as the nation was undergoing tremendous changes in this battle between the forces of slavery and of abolition. The 1850s were a tumultuous time, and by turning to history, we can see Douglass as he tries to navigate those exceedingly difficult times with some integrity. What I love about reading Douglass in this period before the Civil War is you see him changing his mind about some things. You see him doubling down on other commitments and principles. And you also see some ambiguity about what to believe. So I want to trace those out, thinking about Douglass historically in this decade or so, 1850s. So the 1850s were really a tumultuous time. There is the Fugitive Slave Law, 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. There were a number of these legislative items that were designed to maintain the power of the slaveholding South, the slaveholding system. In effect, Northerners who might have been abolitionists were forced to comply with a law that said, hey, if there is an escaped slave in your presence, you are legally obligated to return that slave to the powers of that be, to the slaveholder and to those agents of the slaveholder who went to the northern cities looking for slaves. And of course, we know that even if they didn't find the particular escaped slave they were looking for, that taking any Black person, slave or free, would fit the bill. And Douglass and other abolitionists railed against the legislation, but what to do with the rage, what to do with the frustration. In part, you see Douglass turning to scripture, turning to Isaiah, turning to prophets, turning to Psalms, turning to Lamentations to voice the rage. But then in his speeches, he names it. He names why he raged against this, not just legislation, but the way the nation was going. So in the early 1850s, we see a Frederick Douglass who is changing his mind. Initially, when he first escaped from slavery, late 1830s, 1838, 1839, and up until the time he met William Lloyd Garrison band of abolitionists in 1841, Douglass believed, along with Garrison, that the Constitution was essentially a slaveholding document. And Garrison would say, no union with slaveholders, because if you acknowledge or concede that the Constitution is essentially a slaveholding document, then what is the Union if not a slaveholding union? And Douglass agreed. And he went out on the lecture circuit and he preached across the North that the US Constitution was essentially a slaveholding document and that therefore the answer was no union with slaveholders. but he changed. And as we move into the 1840s and the early 1850s, the great thing about history, by looking at the narratives, the books he wrote in 1848, 1855, his speeches, you see that Douglass is slowly changing his position. And that has everything to do with his thinking about what happens to those slaves in the South if we concede that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. They have no hope. There is nothing that they can hold on to. So Douglass begins to change his position. And of course, he's aided by other Northerners who have a more political posture when it comes to abolition. So their idea is use the vote, gain the vote, use the vote, change legislation, change policy, so that you don't just concede the Constitution, but you interpret it in a way that is really consistent with the cause of abolition. And Douglass begins to take that position. So you see over time how he changes his position on how to understand the Constitution. Is it fundamentally a pro-slavery document? Is it not? Can it be read in a way that embraces and endorses abolition? And Douglass comes to say yes. So turning to history, you can see Douglass over time, from his 1845 narrative of the life to his 1855 My Bondage and My Freedom. He changes his thinking about the Constitution. You can also see places where Douglass doubles down. And the slave who had fought his overseer was one for whom having violence on the table was a necessary part of the work of abolition. That's not to say that he endorsed violence or being violent for the sake of violence, but the moral suasion position of abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison was one that never sat comfortably with Frederick Douglass. And throughout the course of his life, you see Douglass again returning to that theme, not to be violent, but that slavery is violence, and resisting the power that enslaves, even if it means fighting an overseer, even if it means fighting in a civil war, even if it means fighting the forces that enslave people, that violence is justifiable. And Douglass says this repeatedly, defiantly, over and over again. That's a principle that he never loses. On the contrary, he doubles down on this idea that God is with those who fight injustice, even if that fight requires violence, as it did in his fight against the overseer Covey. In a famous interaction during one of his abolitionist conventions, he found himself in a room with Sojourner Truth, among other abolitionists in their audience, and Douglass was holding court. And as he had the floor, he talked about the fact that slaves might be compelled to fight back against their slaveholders, and that was not wrong. And as he was speaking, Sojourner Truth interjected, something to the effect of, "Fred, is God gone?" And the report of that convention says that Douglass paused for just a second and came right back and said, "No, it's because God is not gone that the slave is justified in using the kind of violence that is necessary against the violence of slavery." That is the quintessential Douglass when it comes to where violence fits in the abolitionist movement. It was never a first resort. It was never something that he took gratuitously or took as something to be done without serious reflection and contemplation. But violence and the use of violence against violence was something that Douglass maintains up until the end of his life.